The Cosby Show curse perfectly embodies the image of America's great father. The most heartwarming television home of the decade was, in fact, the perfect cover for dozens of drug-induced sexual crimes. The man who daily preached morality ruthlessly blacklisted a young actress simply for daring to be authentic, then proceeded to exploit the psyche of a 3-year-old child to create the illusion of a happy family. The true curse wasn't supernatural. It was forged by the psychological destruction of child stars and the cold, calculated silence of an entire industry. In 1984, the American television network NBC was in a state of terminal decline. It was languishing in third place in the ratings war, struggling to find an identity in a rapidly shifting cultural landscape. Furthermore, the sitcom genre itself was widely considered by television executives to be dead. The airways were dominated by glossy escapist primetime soap operas and action-oriented dramas. When the concept of a comedy centered around an upper-middle-class African-American family was first pitched, it was met with intense industry skepticism. Up until that point, the representation of black families on American television had largely been confined to working-class struggles. While shows like Good Times or The Jeffersons broke crucial ground, they often relied on broad stereotypes or narratives defined purely by financial hardship and societal friction. Enter Bill Cosby. At this juncture in history, he was already a respected comedian and an educator, holding a doctorate in education. He approached the network with a vision that was, at the time, quietly revolutionary. He proposed a show about the Huxtables. The patriarch, Dr. Heathcliff Huxtable, would be an obstetrician operating his practice from the basement of their beautiful Brooklyn brownstone. The matriarch, Claire Huxtable, would be a fierce, highly successful attorney. They would have 5 children, and the comedy would not stem from racial trauma or poverty, but from the universal, relatable frictions of domestic life. Children refusing to do their homework, the chaotic energy of teenagers navigating first loves, and the gentle, enduring romance between a husband and wife. The political and social climate of the 1980s in America was defined by the Reagan era, a period heavily focused on a return to traditional family values and conservative morality. Cosby astutely recognized this cultural hunger. He positioned his creation not just as entertainment, but as an aspirational blueprint. When the show premiered in September 1984, the response was not merely a success, it was a cultural phenomenon. It became a colossal ratings juggernaut, single-handedly resurrecting the NBC network from the brink of financial ruin. Practically overnight, Bill Cosby was elevated from a successful entertainer to a deity within the Hollywood hierarchy. This unprecedented success granted him an extraordinary, almost terrifying level of power. In the television industry, ratings equate to leverage, and Cosby held the highest ratings in the history of the medium. He was given absolute creative control over the production. The set of the show in Astoria, Queens, became his personal fiefdom. Many television historians and former crew members have noted the strict, almost puritanical atmosphere he enforced on set. There was a rigid code of conduct. The scripts were heavily policed by Cosby himself to ensure that every joke, every interaction, and every storyline reinforced the pristine, unblemished image of the Huxtable family. He employed renowned psychiatric consultants to ensure the show's child-rearing advice was psychologically sound. He demanded that the set walls be adorned with fine African-American art, aiming to elevate the cultural discourse. It was an environment engineered to project absolute perfection. Yet, It is within this very pursuit of the perfect facade that the darkest elements of the story begin to take root. The creation of such an impregnable moral fortress provided the ultimate camouflage. When a man is universally revered as a saint, his shadow becomes entirely invisible to the public eye. The industry, too, became deeply invested in the preservation of this saintly image. The show was generating billions of dollars in advertising revenue and syndication rights. It was the golden goose of the American broadcasting system. This financial reality birthed an environment of collective blindness. When an individual generates that much wealth for a corporate structure, a protective barrier is erected around them. Whispers and rumors, which, according to later investigative reports, were already circulating in the comedy clubs and backrooms of the entertainment industry regarding Cosby's predilection for young women and his use of mysterious pills, were systematically ignored, suppressed, or rationalized. The bystander effect took hold of an entire industry. The executives, the producers, and the managers looked the other way, mesmerized by the soaring ratings and the critical acclaim. However, the suffocating atmosphere of forced perfection on set was bound to create casualties. When an environment is entirely built upon a rigid, unyielding vision of morality dictated by one man, any deviation from that script is perceived not just as an error, but as an act of treason. The young actors cast to play the Huxtable children were not merely playing roles. They were conscripted to be the living embodiments of Cosby's moral doctrine. They were expected to be flawless representatives of the brand, both on and off the screen. The first major fracture in the Huxtable illusion emerged from within the cast itself, sparking a devastating collision between the reality of human nature and the tyrannical control of a hidden predator. Among the young cast was a teenager who possessed a spirit that could not be easily tamed or molded into the conservative parameters of the show. She was hired to play the second oldest daughter, Denise Huxtable. Her name was Lisa Bonet. She was vibrant, fiercely independent, and intrinsically drawn to a bohemian countercultural lifestyle that stood in stark contrast to the ironclad, sanitized world her television father had built. As the show's popularity exploded, turning its cast into global superstars overnight, the young actress found herself trapped in a gilded cage. The conflict that was about to erupt between the man who secretly lived in the darkest corners of human depravity and the young woman who simply yearned to live her truth in the light would set off a tragic chain reaction. It would expose the ruthless lengths to which power will go to protect its own lies, and it would lay the groundwork for a generational trauma that would haunt the cast for decades to come. The conflict between Bill Cosby and Lisa Bonet was not merely a backstage dispute over creative differences. It was a profound ideological collision. The tragedy of her exile is amplified by the sheer cultural weight Denise Huxtable carried in the mid-1980s. When The Cosby Show first aired, Lisa Bonet was just 16 years old. Almost immediately, she became the breakout star for a crucial demographic, the youth. Denise was the cool, eclectic, fashion-forward second daughter. She wore oversized men's shirts, asymmetrical haircuts, and vintage accessories. For millions of teenagers watching, both black and white, she was the undisputed icon of bohemian chic. She represented a generation trying to find its individual voice within the confines of a traditional household. But the girl playing Denise was not a product of Cosby's conservative, sanitized imagination. Lisa Bonet was genuinely bohemian. She was fiercely intellectual, spiritually independent, and possessed an innate rebellion that chafed against the rigid, almost authoritarian atmosphere of the Astoria studios. While the rest of the cast largely capitulated to Cosby's demanding paternalism, viewing him as a mentor and a father figure, Bonet maintained a palpable distance. She did not seek his approval, and in the kingdom of a narcissist, indifference is the ultimate provocation. As the show reached its zenith of popularity, the claustrophobia of playing the perfect daughter began to suffocate her. Cosby demanded that the actors mirror their characters' wholesomeness in their private lives. He was crafting a multi-billion-dollar brand built on moral superiority. However, the sickening irony, which would not be revealed until decades later, was that during the exact same period he was policing the hemlines and off-screen dating habits of his young cast. He was actively utilizing his immense wealth and power to procure sedatives. While he lectured the youth of America on the importance of education and moral fortitude through the television screen, legal documents and testimonies later revealed he was engaging in a systemic campaign of drugging and sexually assaulting women in dressing rooms, hotel suites, and his own homes. This is the core of the ultimate hypocrisy. The predator, hiding in plain sight, became obsessed with controlling the virtue of the young woman who dared to challenge his authority. The breaking point arrived in 1987. Eager to shed the restrictive good girl image of Denise Huxtable and prove her dramatic capabilities, a 19-year-old Lisa Bonet accepted a role in Alan Parker's psychological horror film, Angel Heart. The film was a dark, violent, and explicitly sexual neo-noir starring Mickey Rourke and Robert De Niro. Bonet played Epiphany Proudfoot, a tragic figure involved in the occult. To secure an R rating rather than an X rating, the director actually had to edit down a graphic, blood-soaked sex scene between Bonet and Rourke. To promote the film, Bonet also participated in a provocative topless photo shoot for Interview magazine. When the news of the film and the photographs reached Bill Cosby, his reaction was not just disapproval, it was a calculated righteous fury. He publicly and privately excoriated her. He claimed she was betraying the millions of children who looked up to Denise Huxtable. He framed her artistic choices as a moral failing that threatened the integrity of the entire program. The hypocrisy was staggering. Here was a man secretly drugging and assaulting women in locked rooms, using his unassailable platform as America's dad to publicly shame a 19-year-old girl for acting in a movie. He weaponized conservative morality to paint Lisa Bonet as a deviant, successfully crushing her momentum and reinforcing his own image as a righteous patriarch, all while his horrific crimes remained entirely hidden. The television network, NBC, and the show's producers stood entirely behind Cosby. Corporate complicity was in full force. The executives were terrified that Bonet's independent streak would alienate their conservative viewing base and damage the advertising revenue. Lisa Bonet had become a threat to the machinery of the illusion. Cosby's first retaliatory move was an act of exile masked as an opportunity. In the autumn of 1987, Denise Huxtable was spun off into her own series, A Different World, which followed her character to a fictional historically black college. On paper, it looked like a promotion. In reality, television historians and insiders widely acknowledge it was a mechanism to remove the rebellious Bonet from Cosby's immediate kingdom. He wanted her off his primary set. He wanted to maintain the absolute purity of the Huxtable household, and she had been deemed a contaminant. However, even in exile, Bonet refused to submit. During the production of the first season of A Different World, she began a relationship with a then unknown musician named Lenny Kravitz. The couple quickly eloped, and shortly thereafter, a 20-year-old Bonet discovered she was pregnant. In the real world, a young woman getting married and having a child is a cause for celebration. In the tyrannical ecosystem of the Cosby empire, it was the final, unforgivable sin. When Bonet approached the producers to discuss how they might incorporate her real-life pregnancy into her character's storyline, perhaps using it as a poignant, realistic narrative arc for a young college student, the suggestion was met with absolute draconian rejection. Bill Cosby, the architect of the show, delivered the final verdict. His reasoning, famously relayed by producer Debbie Allen, was brutally simple. Denise Huxtable is not pregnant. He could not tolerate the collision of Bonet's messy, real human life with his pristine, manufactured fiction. The illusion of the Huxtable morality had to be protected at all costs. Bonet was unceremoniously fired from A Different World. She was allowed a brief, humiliating return to the main Cosby Show cast the following year, stripped of her star power, sidelined in minor storylines, before eventually being written out entirely. The punishment, however, did not stop at the edge of the television screen. Cosby's influence extended deep into the executive suites of Hollywood. Following her departure from the show, Bonet found herself facing an invisible wall. She was labeled difficult, uncooperative, and unpredictable. The standard vocabulary used by powerful men in the industry to destroy the momentum of women who refused to comply. This was the era before social media, before artists had a direct line to their audience. If the networks and the studios shut their doors, your career was effectively asphyxiated. Lisa Bonet, one of the most promising, charismatic, and culturally significant actresses of her generation, was quietly and brutally blacklisted. She was forced to the margins of independent cinema, her mainstream trajectory shattered. She was the first major casualty of the Huxtable curse. She was a woman who craved authenticity, crushed by a system that was entirely reliant on a colossal lie. The television industry watched it happen. They watched a young black woman be professionally destroyed for exercising bodily autonomy and artistic freedom. And they did absolutely nothing, because the man holding the axe was making them rich. Lisa Bonet's forced exit solved Cosby's control problem, but it created a ratings nightmare for NBC. The show had lost its teenage demographic. Cosby needed a distraction, someone entirely malleable, with no independent voice and absolutely no capacity for rebellion. In 1989, to plug the hole left by the exiled daughter, the producers introduced a 3-year-old child into the crushing gears of the Hollywood machine. Her name was Raven-Symoné. To introduce a child of that age into the relentless, crushing machinery of a multi-billion-dollar television production is a decision fraught with profound psychological implications. At 3 years old, a human being is only just beginning to form the most basic understanding of self. They are learning to navigate their environment, to understand emotional permanence, and to differentiate between reality and imagination. Raven-Symoné was not afforded this fundamental right of childhood. Instead, she was unceremoniously dropped into an environment defined by glaring studio lights, highly orchestrated scripts, and the suffocating pressure of a global audience. The contrast between the two young women of the Huxtable household is one of the most chilling poetic ironies of this entire narrative. Lisa Bonet, a young adult, was ruthlessly exiled from the set because she dared to live her truth. Raven-Symoné, an infant, was actively recruited to the set specifically to live a lie. Almost overnight, Raven-Symoné became a national sensation. Her undeniable charisma, her impeccable comedic timing, which was extraordinarily rare for a child of her age, and her infectious laugh captivated the American public. She single-handedly revitalized the program's ratings. She was monetized in every conceivable way. Her face was plastered across magazines. She appeared on late-night talk shows. She became the ultimate consumable emblem of the Huxtable family's wholesome perfection. But what the audience, laughing from the comfort of their living rooms, could not possibly perceive was the invisible psychological cage being constructed around her. The set of The Cosby Show, governed by the strict puritanical rules of a man who was secretly operating as a serial predator, was no place for a child to develop a healthy psyche. At 3 years old, Raven-Symoné wasn't given a childhood. She was given a career. Her earliest memories were not of playing in a park, but of hitting her marks, remembering her lines, and ensuring she pleased the powerful adults who controlled her universe. She was taught implicitly and explicitly that her value as a human being was intrinsically tied to her ability to project an image of perfect, uncomplicated happiness. She was the anchor of the America's Dad brand. If she cried, if she was exhausted, if she displayed any of the messy, unpredictable emotions inherent to growing up, she was jeopardizing a production worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The weight of an entire industry rested on the tiny shoulders of a preschooler. The most insidious aspect of this environment was the man at the top of the hierarchy. While there have never been allegations that Bill Cosby harmed the children on his set, the sheer toxicity of his double life infected the entire atmosphere. He demanded absolute moral perfection from his cast, creating an environment of intense scrutiny and fear. He was a tyrant masquerading as a benevolent patriarch. For a young child like Raven, eager to please and entirely dependent on the adults around her, the pressure to conform to Cosby's rigid conservative ideals of what a good black child should be was inescapable. This relentless pressure would eventually manifest in a profound internal crisis that Raven-Symoné would battle for decades. As she grew older, transitioning from the adorable Olivia Kendall into a teenager and then an adult, she began to realize that her true self did not align with the conservative, heteronormative image the world expected of her. For Raven-Symoné, the pressure to maintain the pristine Huxtable illusion didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. It followed her into adulthood. Realizing she was part of the LGBTQ+ community, she spent years actively suppressing her own identity. She had seen firsthand how the Cosby machine exiled Lisa Bonet for stepping out of line. Terrified that living her truth would shatter the nostalgia of millions who still saw her as little Olivia, she remained closeted for years, a child star held hostage by the immense conservative brand she helped save. The trauma of child stardom in this specific context is not merely about a loss of innocence. It is about the active theft of selfhood. Raven-Symoné survived the machinery, eventually finding her voice and her truth later in life. But the scars of being a child soldier in Cosby's war for ratings are permanent. She was commodified to protect a lie, a collateral casualty in a game of power and deception. As the 1990s approached, the golden era of The Cosby Show finally concluded. But when the studio lights in Astoria, Queens were switched off in the spring of 1992, the cast was unceremoniously pushed out of the sanctuary and into the harsh reality of the Hollywood machine. The glossy veneer of the Huxtable empire was visibly cracking. Lisa Bonet was living in forced exile. Raven-Symoné was battling a severe identity crisis behind a manufactured smile. Yet while his television children struggled with the psychological aftermath of his empire, the central pillar of this entire structure, Bill Cosby himself, remained completely untouched. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, he continued to tour, to lecture the public on morality, and to receive prestigious awards from universities and civic organizations. As the cast navigated the harsh reality of their post-show lives, the concept of a Huxtable curse first began to permeate the public consciousness. Initially, it was not recognized as a metaphor for industry complicity, but rather whispered about as a chilling string of literal tragedies. In 1998, the cast suffered a devastating and inexplicable loss. Michelle Thomas, the vibrant young actress who played Justine Phillips, died of a rare stomach cancer. She was only 30 years old. While her tragic death was a solitary medical anomaly, entirely disconnected from Cosby's hidden crimes, it cast a profound, morbid shadow over the show's sunny legacy. To the public eye, a dark cloud was slowly gathering over the once untouchable television family, serving as a grim prelude to the man-made horrors that were yet to be exposed. The industry's code of silence was functioning perfectly. The executives knew of his reputation. The whispers in the comedy clubs had grown into a steady, undeniable hum. Dozens of women were living with the silent, suffocating trauma of what he had done to them in dressing rooms and hotel suites. But the money was simply too good. The power structure protected its most valuable asset. The suffering of the women and the psychological toll taken on his young cast were considered acceptable collateral damage in the maintenance of an empire. However, a foundation built entirely on lies, manipulation, and the suppression of truth cannot hold indefinitely. The world was about to enter a new era of digital communication, where the traditional gatekeepers of media could no longer silence the voices of the victims. The stage was being set for the ultimate reckoning. The predator who had judged the truthful, the man who had built a kingdom of morality to hide a basement of horrors, was about to face a collapse of historical proportions. The laughter was about to stop. The final devastating truth was waiting to be unleashed. A truth that would not only destroy a television icon, but would irreversibly traumatize the actors who had innocently called him Dad. For decades, the American entertainment industry operated under a silent, unbreakable covenant. It was a system built on the preservation of highly profitable illusions. If a television program generated sufficient revenue, if a star commanded enough cultural authority, a protective perimeter was erected around them. This was the fortress that housed Bill Cosby. Throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s, even as his former cast members navigated the treacherous waters of forced exile, identity crises, and profound personal tragedy, the patriarch himself remained utterly untouchable. He was not merely a wealthy actor. He had evolved into an institution. Universities showered him with honorary doctorates. Civic organizations bestowed him with their highest accolades. He continued to don the metaphorical cardigan of Dr. Heathcliff Huxtable, embarking on nationwide speaking tours where he openly lectured working-class families on their moral failings. The audacity of this era is difficult to fully comprehend in retrospect. Here was a man using the unassailable platform of America's dad to scold the public about personal responsibility and ethical behavior, while simultaneously relying on a vast network of enablers, lawyers, and silent executives to bury a trail of devastated women. The rumors of his predatory behavior, the whispers of drugged drinks, silenced victims, and clandestine settlements were an open secret in the comedy clubs of Los Angeles and New York. Journalists occasionally attempted to breach the walls, publishing investigative pieces that hinted at the darkness. Yet, every time, the formidable public relations machinery of the Cosby empire, aided by the willful blindness of a complicit media, successfully neutralized the threat. The public simply did not want to believe that the architect of their favorite television family was a monster. The cognitive dissonance was too painful. However, the architecture of power began to fundamentally shift in the mid-2000s. The traditional gatekeepers of information, the network executives and the major publishing houses, were losing their monopoly over the narrative. The advent of social media democratized the dissemination of truth, creating an environment where a single, unvarnished statement could ignite a global firestorm. The catalyst for the ultimate reckoning did not come from a courtroom or a major journalistic expose. It arrived rather fittingly on a comedy stage. In October 2014, a comedian named Hannibal Buress performed a routine in Philadelphia in which he bluntly addressed Cosby's rampant hypocrisy. Buress pointed out the grotesque irony of a man demanding moral perfection from the public while facing numerous suppressed allegations of sexual assault. A spectator filmed this specific portion of the set on a mobile phone and uploaded it to the internet. In previous decades, this incident would have been an isolated footnote, easily contained by Cosby's legal team. But in the digital age, the video acted as a spark dropped into a powder keg. It went viral, tearing through the protective barrier that had shielded Cosby for half a century. The dam finally broke. What followed was an avalanche of human trauma that shocked the world. Over 60 women stepped forward into the glaring light of public scrutiny. They were models, actresses, waitresses, and executives. Their stories, spanning across multiple decades, were chillingly consistent. They detailed a predatory modus operandi that weaponized the very trust Cosby had cultivated through his television persona. They described being invited to his hotel suites or dressing rooms under the guise of career mentorship, a scenario made plausible because he was, after all, the most respected father figure in America. They recounted being offered a drink or a pill, ostensibly to help them relax, and then they described the terrifying descent into chemical paralysis, the loss of consciousness, and the horrific reality of waking up to realize they had been assaulted. The weapon of choice, according to widespread testimonies and later legal documents, was Quaaludes, a powerful central nervous system depressant. Cosby was not a man losing control in a moment of passion. This was the calculated, systemic, and chemical subjugation of women. As the sheer volume and horrific detail of these allegations saturated the global news cycle, the cast of The Cosby Show faced a profound psychological reckoning. The revelations forced the cast into a disorienting reality. For 8 years, they had reported to a set that they believed was a sanctuary of familial warmth and professional excellence. They had looked to Bill Cosby not just as an employer, but as a mentor, a trailblazer, and a surrogate father. Lisa Bonet had been professionally exiled by this man for taking a role in an adult film. Raven-Symoné had been forced to suppress her true identity to adhere to his strict conservative brand. The entire cast had spent their formative years trying to live up to the impossible standards he had set. Now the horrifying truth was undeniable. The moral compass they had been forced to follow was entirely broken. The man who had policed their behavior was a prolific predator. The cast members found themselves trapped in a cruel, unyielding spotlight. The media aggressively pursued them, demanding statements, reactions, and condemnations. They were essentially being asked to answer for the crimes of their abuser. For years, their association with The Cosby Show had been their proudest professional achievement. It was their legacy. In a matter of months, that legacy was entirely dismantled. They were forced to reconcile their fond memories of a groundbreaking television production with the grotesque reality of the man who ran it. It was a collective psychological wound that no amount of time or public relations could ever fully heal. The Huxtable curse was no longer a superstition about stalling careers or tragic illnesses. It was the very real visceral trauma of realizing their entire professional foundation was a crime scene. The public demanded justice, and for a brief fleeting moment it appeared that the legal system might actually deliver it. In 2018, the unthinkable happened. Bill Cosby, the untouchable titan of American culture, was convicted of aggravated, indecent assault. The image of the 80-year-old entertainer handcuffed and led away to a state penitentiary was broadcast around the world. For the dozens of women who had endured decades of silence, public smearing, and psychological torture, it was a moment of profound, tearful vindication. It sent a powerful message that no amount of wealth, status, or nostalgic capital could protect a predator from the consequences of his actions. However, the Hollywood machine and the American legal system share a common cynical trait. They inherently protect the powerful. The relief was short-lived. In a devastating turn of events that exposed the cold, mechanical nature of the judicial process, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned Cosby's conviction in June 2021. He was not exonerated. The court did not declare him innocent of the crimes. He was released on a procedural technicality. A previous district attorney had allegedly made a verbal agreement years prior, promising not to prosecute Cosby criminally if he provided a deposition in a civil case. The highest court ruled that this agreement, regardless of the horrifying admissions made within that deposition regarding the use of quaaludes, bound the hands of future prosecutors. The prison doors opened, and Bill Cosby walked free. He returned to his sprawling estate, flashing a defiant peace sign to the cameras. This was the ultimate crushing blow. It was a stark, infuriating reminder of how the system is heavily weighted in favor of men with unlimited financial resources and legal influence. For the victims, it was a brutal betrayal. But for the legacy of The Cosby Show, it was the final nail in the coffin. The show had been quietly pulled from syndication networks across the globe as the allegations mounted. The billions of dollars in rerun revenue dried up almost overnight, but the financial loss was secondary to the cultural destruction. Nostalgia, one of the most powerful emotional forces in human psychology, had been irrevocably poisoned. It is now virtually impossible to watch an episode of The Cosby Show with a sense of innocent joy. The context has been entirely rewritten by history. When audiences attempt to watch Dr. Huxtable dispensing fatherly advice, the warmth is replaced by a chilling dissonance. The canned studio laughter that echoes after every punchline no longer sounds like the innocent amusement of a bygone era. It sounds like the willful ignorance of a complicit industry. It sounds like a mechanism designed to drown out the cries of the women who were being destroyed just off camera. The actors who played the Huxtable children faced an immediate paralyzing conflict. For years, actors like Malcolm Jamal Warner, Keshia Knight Pulliam, and Tempest Bledsoe had grown up under the direct tutelage of a man who demanded absolute moral perfection. Cosby had positioned himself as the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong, not just on the script pages, but in their actual formative lives. He lectured them on responsibility, education, and respectability. To these child actors, and even to the adult professionals on set, his authority was absolute. When the fortress finally collapsed and the horrifying truth of his double life was dragged into the light, these actors were not merely losing a former boss. They were experiencing the sudden, violent shattering of their foundational reality. The psychological term for this is betrayal trauma. It occurs when the people or institutions that an individual relies upon for support and survival violate that trust in a fundamental way. The media, hungry for scandal and sound bites, showed no mercy to the surviving cast members. As the allegations mounted, microphones were violently shoved into the faces of actors who were entirely innocent of any wrongdoing. They were ambushed on red carpets, stalked outside their homes, and relentlessly pressured to publicly condemn the man who had shaped their early careers. The public demanded that they perform their shock and grief on command. This placed the cast in an agonizing, impossible double bind. On one hand, to defend Cosby, as a few initially mistakenly attempted to do out of loyalty or denial, was to invite the ferocious wrath of a public rightly disgusted by his crimes. It was to align oneself with a predator. On the other hand, to publicly condemn him meant actively participating in the destruction of their own legacy. It meant admitting that the proudest achievement of their professional lives, a show that had made television history, was nothing more than a front for a criminal enterprise. Furthermore, there was a deeply complex racial dynamic at play that made this burden even heavier. The Cosby Show was not just a sitcom. It was a monumental milestone in the representation of Black Americans on global television. It dismantled harmful stereotypes and showcased Black excellence, education, and familial love to a world that desperately needed to see it. Bill Cosby had cynically weaponized this cultural significance to shield himself. For years, he and his defenders had framed any attack on him as an attack on Black progress itself. For the Black actors who had starred alongside him, speaking out meant navigating a treacherous cultural minefield. They felt an immense, suffocating pressure to protect the positive legacy of the Huxtable family for the sake of the culture, while simultaneously grappling with the personal horror of who the patriarch truly was. They were held hostage by the importance of the show. Lisa Bonet had been exiled for threatening the illusion. Now the rest of the cast was trapped by the debris of its collapse. Malcolm Jamal Warner once articulated this specific pain with heartbreaking clarity. He noted that the legacy of the show, which had done so much good for so many people, was now irrevocably tarnished. He mourned not for the predator, but for the millions of families, and for his fellow castmates who had their pure, nostalgic memories violently stolen from them. The blast radius of the Huxtable legacy actively destroyed the present realities of the people who helped build the empire. The most chilling psychological manifestation of this curse is found in the reaction of Phylicia Rashad, the actress who masterfully portrayed Claire Huxtable. For decades, Claire was the undisputed matriarch of American television, a brilliant, fierce, and fiercely protective attorney who tolerated zero foolishness. Rashad and Cosby were viewed by the public as an inseparable, iconic unit. When the horrifying allegations against Cosby became undeniable, the public looked to Rashad, expecting the righteous indignation of the woman who played Claire. Instead, they witnessed the devastating power of profound cognitive dissonance. Rashad consistently defended Cosby. The psychological tether he had established over decades of portraying her perfect husband had seemingly warped her perception of reality. The climax of this tragedy occurred in June 2021 when Cosby's conviction was overturned on a procedural technicality. As the predator walked free, Rashad took to social media and posted a celebratory message. Finally, a terrible wrong is being righted. A miscarriage of justice is corrected. The backlash was instantaneous and severe. At the time, Rashad had just been appointed as the Dean of the College of Fine Arts at Howard University, a prestigious, historically black institution. The student body and alumni erupted in fury, deeply traumatized that a woman in a position of immense academic power was openly celebrating the release of a convicted serial assaulter. She was forced to issue a humiliating apology, her own magnificent legacy permanently stained. Rashad's reaction is perhaps the darkest triumph of Cosby's manipulation. He had engineered a psychological reality so impenetrable that the woman who stood beside him for 8 years chose to immolate her own hard-earned reputation rather than accept the monstrous truth of who he was. She, too, was a victim of the curse, blinded by the very illusion she helped create. Beyond the psychological damage, the fallout carried a brutal socioeconomic reality, epitomized by the fate of actor Jeffrey Owens. Owens played Elvin Thibodeau, the earnest, slightly naive son-in-law of the Huxtable family. He was a classically trained theater actor who brought genuine warmth to the role. In a just world, an actor who spent years on the most successful sitcom in global history would be financially secure for life, sustained by residual syndication checks. But the Huxtable curse operates on a grotesque paradox. As Cosby's crimes were exposed, television networks globally pulled The Cosby Show from their syndication lineups. The show became completely radioactive. Overnight, the passive income that the supporting cast relied upon evaporated. In September 2018, the absolute cruelty of this reality was captured in a single photograph. A tabloid published secretly taken pictures of Jeffrey Owens working as a cashier at a Trader Joe's grocery store in New Jersey. He was bagging groceries to make ends meet and keep his health insurance. The media and public initially reacted with vicious job shaming. The contrast was physically nauseating. Bill Cosby, the architect of the trauma, was sitting in a multi-million-dollar estate flanked by elite defense attorneys, while Jeffrey Owens, an honest, hard-working man whose financial security was stolen by Cosby's crimes, was being mocked by the world for doing honest labor. Owens handled the intense public humiliation with extraordinary grace and dignity, but the image remains a stark indictment of the Hollywood machine. The predator retained his immense wealth. The innocent collateral damage was left to bag groceries and face public ridicule. Furthermore, the curse ensured that anyone who dared to break ranks and speak the truth would be treated as a traitor. Joseph C. Phillips, the actor who played Navy Lieutenant Martin Kendall, the husband of Lisa Bonet's character and father to Raven-Symoné's character, learned this lesson the hard way. Unlike those who remained silent or offered blind defense, Phillips chose to confront the darkness. In 2015, as the avalanche of accusations was at its peak, he penned a raw, deeply agonizing essay titled, "Of Course, Bill Cosby is Guilty." In the essay, Phillips detailed a heartbreaking encounter with an old female friend who broke down in tears and confessed that she, too, had been drugged and assaulted by Cosby. By writing this essay, Phillips was doing the right thing. He was validating the victims. Yet the Hollywood ecosystem and a protective segment of the public punished him for it. He faced intense backlash, accused of tearing down a black icon and destroying the community's most beloved television family. Much like Lisa Bonet in the 1980s, Phillips discovered that the machine demands absolute loyalty to the lie. Telling the truth about the patriarch did not bring liberation, it brought isolation. The curse dictates that the whistleblowers are punished just as severely as the enablers. The visual spectacle of Cosby's 2017 sexual assault trial revealed how he actively deployed this manipulation in real time. When a predator faces justice, they often retreat into the shadows. Cosby, however, weaponized the nostalgia of his television empire one final time. On the opening day of his trial, as he walked past a gauntlet of flashing cameras and screaming protesters, he was not leaning on his lawyers, nor was he walking alongside his real-life wife. He walked arm in arm with Keisha Knight Pulliam. Pulliam had played Rudy Huxtable, the youngest, most adorable daughter of the original cast. For millions of viewers, she was the ultimate symbol of childhood innocence. Cosby understood the subliminal power of this image. By bringing the actress who played Rudy to the courthouse, he was attempting to subconsciously project the aura of Dr. Huxtable. He was using a young woman he had known since she was a toddler as a human shield against the horrific testimonies of the women he had drugged and assaulted. The media immediately turned their crosshairs on Pulliam. She was subjected to intense public vitriol for supporting a predator. Yet, looking at the dynamic through the lens of the Huxtable curse, a more disturbing reality emerges. Pulliam was trapped in the impossible loyalty of a child actor who genuinely loved the man who had given her a career. Cosby exploited that genuine, innocent affection to orchestrate a cynical PR stunt. He allowed his television daughter to walk into a storm of public hatred, sacrificing her peace of mind simply to soften his own image for the evening news. It was the ultimate betrayal of the paternal role he claimed to embody. The curse dictates that the predator will use the children he raised on screen to absorb the bullets meant for him, but the darkest manifestation of this curse extends beyond the actors on the call sheet. It infected the broader cultural landscape, specifically the African American community, who had placed their collective hope in the Huxtable image. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, The Cosby Show was not merely a sitcom. It was a vital, desperately needed counter-narrative to decades of harmful, marginalizing media stereotypes. It showcased Black excellence, education, and unbroken family units to a global audience. Cosby was acutely aware of the immense, almost sacred cultural capital he held. When the avalanche of allegations threatened to bury him, he did not merely deny them. He cynically attempted to frame the accusations as a racially motivated conspiracy. His defense team and his surrogates planted the narrative that the justice system was simply trying to tear down a powerful Black icon. This was perhaps the most sinister mechanism of the entire curse. Cosby weaponized the very real historical trauma of systemic racism to shield himself from the consequences of his own predatory behavior. He forced an entire community into an agonizing psychological bind. To hold him accountable felt, for many, like actively participating in the destruction of their own most cherished representation. He held cultural progress hostage to protect his basement of horrors. He made the public feel that by advocating for the dozens of violated women, they were somehow betraying the broader cause of racial advancement. The curse, in its final macro form, was the realization that the man who built the ultimate monument to black dignity had secretly laid its foundation on the broken bodies of women, leaving an entire generation paralyzed by grief for a hero who never actually existed. But perhaps the most expansive yet entirely invisible victims of the Huxtable curse are the hundreds of working-class professionals who existed strictly behind the camera. The Cosby Show was a massive logistical operation. It employed brilliant black writers, pioneering directors, set designers, wardrobe stylists, and camera operators. For years, having The Cosby Show at the top of a Hollywood resume was a golden ticket. It signified that you had worked at the absolute pinnacle of television excellence. After 2014, that golden ticket turned to ash. Industry professionals quietly began scrubbing the show from their CVs, terrified that the association with a prolific sexual predator would cost them future employment. Their proudest artistic achievement, the late nights spent crafting a groundbreaking show that shifted the cultural landscape, was stolen from them. They cannot show their grandchildren the episodes they wrote or directed without having to explain the monster lurking in the lead role. Cosby did not just steal from the women he assaulted, he committed a mass historical erasure. He poisoned the well so thoroughly that an entire era of brilliant collaborative black television history had to be sealed away in a vault of shame. The true curse of the Huxtable legacy is not supernatural. It is the enduring silent struggle of an entire ecosystem, the exiled rebels, the exploited child stars, the ruined legacies of loyal co-stars, and the erased achievements of a brilliant crew. They were all forced to walk through life carrying the toxic ghost of a man they once called Dad. The warmth was a performance, the morality a weapon, and the ultimate tragedy is that a complicit industry watched the destruction unfold, choosing to protect the brand and let the cameras keep rolling.